You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Welcome back. In today's episode, a new type of episode where we're going to talk about all the things that have happened in our Discord channel over the past week. Now, I used AI to help organize and compile everything so we could get an episode out faster. So I'm going to go through and talk about all the things that that happened in several of our big Discord channels. It will be a quick way if you're a member of the Discord community to kind of get a recap and maybe dig back into some of the things you missed. And if you're not a member of the Discord channel, maybe it'll encourage you to go over and join Discord. I think it'd be cool. It's completely free. Go to vsl.aero and you'll find a link to join up. So to get things started, we're going to start with our private pilot discussion. This is our private pilot little channel on there. So we kicked off things with John Foster asking how to log flight hours on the FAA 8710. So when you're filling this out in Niagara, there's two fields for two different aircraft. And he had a question because he trained in two different aircraft. Does he have to put the PIC in both of those fields? And the answer is no. That is specifically if you're going to use two different aircraft for a check ride. So there are certain instances where you might need to use two different aircraft for a check ride. It used to be much more common when the commercial check ride, you had to demonstrate proficiency in a complex aircraft. So people would take most of their check ride in a simple, non-complex aircraft, then step over to a complex aircraft and do a lap around the pattern, demonstrate proficiency in that. That's no longer really done. So I've only done a couple check rides where the second aircraft block is used. So then the topic shifted over to high altitude operations in a Piper Cherokee, Perspective Warp username, who flies out of KBJC near Denver, raised excellent points about applying POH procedures at high altitudes. He noted confusion around leaning during run-up and adjusting V-speeds for performance at elevation. One of our CFI's, Camden username, explained that VX and VY converge at higher altitudes and leaning for best power during run-up, then using the mixture setting for takeoff as standard above 3,000 feet density altitude. It was a good discussion, especially for high altitude operations. And I agree there. This is a little uncomfortable for some people because leaning the aircraft for best power at high altitude isn't something that's covered in a lot of POHs. So if you're a new pilot, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable doing a procedure that's not outlined in your POH or a checklist, but it's really important for you to do that in order to get best power out of that airport. One time, I'll share a quick story. I forgot to do this in my travel air. I was in Albuquerque, which is high density altitude airport. And as I was taking off from Albuquerque, looked out, enjoying the view of the mountains there, and something caught my eye out of my left window, and I looked back and I was streaming like a little bit of black smoke out of the left engine. Panicked for just a second, then realized that I'd forgot to lean for best power. And so I had an overly rich mixture, which was showing as black smoke because that unburnt fuel that's in the exhaust showing up as black smoke coming out of the engine. Leaned it back for best power, and that smoke cleared up, obviously. So it's definitely something that could happen. Luckily it was a clear day. I had a lot of excess power as a light aircraft, but it could have been a lot worse if you're in a single engine airplane, kind of really performance limited at a short runway especially. That would be really critical. So, I missed that. And, if I miss it, somebody else could miss it for sure. So make sure you're leaning for best power at high density altitudes. All right, moving on to our instrument pilot discussion. Op Potato shared the challenge of flying partial panel with simulated dual G5 failures. Camden jumped in to clarify dependencies between AHRS, ADC, and how backup instruments and battery power work on an aircraft like a DA-40. That was a good discussion. We also covered MEIAs and MOCAs and why MEIAs guarantee both obstacle clearance and signal reception. Study tips, too, for Shepherd Air, Pilot's Cafe, IFR Review Guide, and the value of cross-referencing the ACS and FARs. Another major topic was IFR departures from non-towered airports in Class G airspace. The key takeaway, when you're on an IFR flight plan on the ground at a Class G field, ATC is not going to clear you for takeoff. They're going to give you a clearance void time. And really, you're taking on the responsibility of separation from other aircraft that may or may not be in the pattern there at Class G. Remember, Class G weather requirements are quite low, 1 mile clear clouds. So in theory, you could be flying on a day that's very poor weather, very poor visibility, poor ceilings, and there could be legally still a VFR aircraft in the pattern. Or it could be like a helicopter, maybe emergency helicopter that's doing operations in 2 miles visibility, clear clouds. ATC may not even have radar coverage to see that, so they don't know that it's a threat. So once you pick up your clearance, you're going to need to make your advisory calls and make sure you can ensure your own traffic clearance while you take off. What ATC is going to do for you is they're going to make sure no other IFR aircraft are a threat to you. So they won't allow anybody, for instance, to begin an approach into a field until they've positively identified you on radar. So that was a good discussion that we had there. User Flying Ace asked when it's safe to turn after taking off an ODP. The FAA standard says wait until 400 feet AGL unless otherwise specified. And Ryan Bodecker, who's a great trusted CFI that we have on the channel there, shared additional TERPS guidance on climb gradient and initial climb areas. And I would agree with Ryan that the ICA, that initial climb area, is a protected airspace that's going to take you up to 400 feet. And I really couldn't find any examples where a turn before 400 feet, even with an ODP, is required. The closest that I could find is maybe departing north out of DCA when you have the prohibited area. You need to start that turn as soon as possible, but it doesn't say a specific altitude. It just says when practical, I think, is how it's worded. So I think the ICA at every airport for the TERPS is going to be cleared up to 400 feet. So you wouldn't have to start an ODP before 400. Now, an ODP may require you to fly runway heading further than 400 feet. So it may say fly runway heading up to, 3,000 feet before making a turn. So that's common, but nothing lower. All right, over on our commercial pilot channel, user MTAS172 asked if the VSL ACE guide could be used during the oral portion of his commercial check ride. I would say yes, absolutely. You can use the VSL ACE guide. It's really helpful, but just like with any other set of notes that you're using on a check ride, if you're having to use that to answer every single question, you're probably going to get a disapproval for not having the proper level of knowledge. So you don't want to be overly dependent on anything that you bring into the check ride. But there's really not a lot of regulations telling what we can and can't bring into that check ride. I know a lot of people think that I can only bring FAA material in there. Well, you can bring notes and stuff too. That's fine. But the problem arises when you're overly reliant on whatever you bring in there. So you want to make sure you have a working knowledge. But, answering the examiner after they ask a question maybe you're not familiar with, just answering in a way saying, hey, I'm not really sure. I think this is the answer, but I know where to look it up. So if you don't mind, I'm going to reference my notes real quick. That's a great way to answer anything that you might not know during the check ride. All right. User Jaeger brought up a VA confusion in the 172P. We discussed how maneuvering speeds vary with weight and how recommended maneuver speeds for training maneuvers don't always line up with VA. Camden, Bugs Basher, and John, our fast team rep, all weighed in with excellent details. We basically just talked about, hey, when is it good to use VA? And what if the recommended speeds for, let's say, a Chandelle are over VA? Is that good, or should we back the speeds up to VA? The answer is it kind of depends, and you're going to need to use your judgment as pilot in command. There's nothing really in the airman certification standards that would, give you a hard, well, you didn't do this speed, so that's a failure. As an examiner on which, part of that is I want to see you analyze that. And first of all, being able to say, hey, I calculated VA. VA is actually less than the recommended entry speed for this maneuver. So I'm going to do the maneuver maybe a little bit less, or I'm going to be very cognizant of if this maneuver is going to require anything close to full deflection or abrupt maneuvers. So like a Chandel's very smooth maneuver doesn't require abrupt maneuvers or full deflection. So you could safely do a Chandelle over VA, but maybe an accelerated stall, that's something you would definitely want to calculate. And if your VA is calculated at a lower airspeed, you would want to do that lower airspeed. So we had a good discussion about that. We also fielded questions about transitioning from Cherokee to Skyhawk. Consensus range from 5 to 20 hours, depending on the wing, design, familiarity, and pilot proficiency. I'd say, yeah, that's probably a good estimate there, 5 to 20 hours. Lastly, Mike W. raised a nuanced question on dry lease versus wet lease operational control. And I explained that the dry lease includes the aircraft only, and a wet lease includes the aircraft and at least one crew member. It could be a flight attendant, it could be a pilot. But basically, that's the difference. And then pilot services under Part 91 are legal. They're not a dry lease or a wet lease necessarily, as you're just giving pilot services. And so the key there is just making sure you know who's in operational control of the plane. Next, we go on to our CFI MEI discussion. User Blake asked about teaching VFR navigation using proper paper versus ForeFlight. Bug Smasher and Camden leaned toward teaching fundamentals first with paper and E6B, while Adam G encouraged adopting to what makes sense for the student. So I shared kind of my hybrid method of you plan manually, plan in ForeFlight, and then go fly, and then compare. And your paper plan, your ForeFlight plan, and your actual result should be within 10% of one another. I think that's a good goal, is to get within that 10% range. All right, Camden also raised a CDI sensitivity question. While full deflection is sometimes listed as 10 to 20 degrees, we had CFI of the Year and DPE Adam Boyd, who's on the server, explained how CDI dot ranges affect that number, and I joined him to confirm the practical use doesn't require you to know the exact deflection, but it helps to understand them for written tests. I think both Adam and I kind of agree here that it's not something that necessarily makes you a safer pilot or better pilot, knowing the minutia of, is it 10 or 12 degrees? How much does that matter? Generally speaking, for checkride purposes especially, you're looking at quarter scale deflection, half scale deflection, 3/4 scale deflection. We're not measuring in degrees like it discusses here, but that's still kind of some good information to know. Scarlet Aviator asked about accelerated CFI programs using personal aircraft, and Matt S. pointed them to Mike Farlow's program. Mike Farlow's got a great little school there in Denton, and hopefully would be able to help him out. We also talked about ForeFlight preferred route sources. Some say it's based on commonly filed routes, especially between Class B airports. We had a longer conversation on that. I think we did track down some actual answers there. But essentially, there's kind of three places that the ForeFlight could find these routes from. One is the preferred route, which is going to be published in the chart supplement. And then you have a commonly filed option, which is just that. It's commonly filed. And then you'll have like a ATC cleared, which is going to be, hey, these are the most common places or routes that are cleared at ATC. So we discussed all of those. Then we had our general discussion, which is just general topics there. We rounded out the week with a range of great questions. User Trey asked about scheduling Part 61 check ride after 141 training. The advice was use your school's DPE if possible for consistency. This brings up an awesome question of, let's say that you did your training under Part 141. All of your check rides are going to be done under 61. There's no such thing as a 141 check ride from a DPE. Now, if you have self-examining authority, that's a little bit different. But let's say that a DPE is giving your check ride. They're using Part 61 to conduct the check ride. You just use 141 to qualify for it. Now, what's important to remember is that your 141 graduation certificate is only valid for 60 days. So let's say you do your EOC, you've got your graduation certificate, and it takes you 90 days to schedule a check ride. Well, your EOC is no longer valid. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take your check ride, right? You could take your check ride under Part 61 if you qualify under 61. But, the 61 qualifications for a check ride and 141 are a lot different. In the cases of like solo, there's only 5 hours required in a 141 program, and there's 10 hours required in 61. So if you have the 10 hours of solo and you meet all the 61 requirements, then you could go ahead and take your check ride with an expired graduation certificate. You're just not taking a 141 qualified check ride. You're taking just a pure Part 61. So that's important to note there. Make sure that your EOC and graduation certificate are valid within the last 60 days. All right, user Jaeger inquired strange markings at KSNA. Turns out they were helipad remnants. CFI Wannabe had a question about ICAO flight plan entries, and we discussed person codes and weather briefing habits. Perfect Gnome asked how to study FAR-AIM consensus, use it as a reference, not a textbook, and lean towards the ACS. I'd say the ACE guide also helps out a lot there. User Flying Ace asked about ODP turns again, 400 feet, unless otherwise noted. Jaeger checked LAX landing fees. Ouch. Non-permitted aircraft like a 172P pay over $100, I think is what we found there if you want to land at LAX. Movie Life Matt brought up a traffic pattern entry when overflight is restricted. Adam G. and others gave tips for safe entries. Ben Flying asked about checkrides. Flows or checklists. Flows are fine, but always back them up with a printed checklist. So we had a good discussion about, if you're single pilot, before landing checklist, do I expect you to pull out the paper checklist and review it? The answer is it kind of depends. If you're task saturated and you do the flow and you complete everything from memory and you don't have time to reference the paper checklist, that's fine. Now, in a crewed aircraft, you have a pilot monitoring that's always able to run that checklist. What I would be concerned about is if you're sacrificing kind of looking out and being distracted in a critical phase of flight just to pull out a piece of paper to make sure that a couple of things that you've done have been done correctly. Now, ideally, you maybe would review that paper checklist well before you get in that congested environment of the airport and then do the flow later. So it's almost backwards. You're doing the checklist, kind of referencing it first and then doing your flow later. But yeah, I don't expect you to pull out the paper checklist while you're on short final there to make sure you've covered everything. Coder clarified alternate minimums for airports without approaches. And finally, we touched on discovery flights. I explained that without endorsements, they're not instructional time. These are meant to be marketing flights, not training events. This actually brought up an interesting topic. I might talk about that more in a future episode. But there seems to be some disconnect between what the TSA allows and what the FAA allows. So the TSA specifically talks about kind of demonstration flights in regards to training, and that's never really talked about in the Part 61 privileges and limitations of a CFI. So my concern is, if you're giving a discovery flight and it's not really flight training, the fine line that you're walking is you want to make sure you're not doing an illegal aerial tour, which sounds kind of funny, but really a discovery flight could be viewed as some sort of sightseeing tour, right? And it definitely could be abused that way. And so that's a protected activity that you need a letter of authorization to do. So offering discovery flights that, you aren't providing instruction. Anyway, it's a whole can of worms. We might discuss it in a future episode. All right, so that's it for this week's Roundup. Huge thanks to everyone on the Discord community for continuing to share their knowledge and support. These conversations, I think, really help all of us be better, safer pilots, right? It's a great community to get involved in and just read through. And especially if you're sitting there waiting on a check ride or you haven't flown in a while and you're wanting to find a way to stay engaged throughout the week, it's really good. So I really have been enjoying the Discord community. We're up to like 850 members now, I think. So anyway, thanks for listening. Let me know if you like this type of content. I'm considering making it a regular thing if you like to hear what we're talking about on Discord. And I look forward to talking to y'all again soon. See ya.